The blade was an inch from Walter Weston's throat before he even got the wagon brake set. Human. The orc warrior spat the word like a curse, his tusked jaw inches from Walter's face, a notched war axe resting on his shoulder. Behind him, 3 more Skarn clan warriors ringed the wagon, hands on hafts, eyes narrow with the particular hatred that came from old wars neither side had chosen to end. No trader crosses Ashfall Pass without a writ. You have no writ. You have furs. You have a wagon. You have a very short time left to explain why you should keep your head. Walter kept his hands open and away from his belt knife, though his heart hammered so hard he could feel it in his teeth. I have a trade agreement, he said, voice steadier than he felt. Struck 3 seasons past with the garrison quartermaster at Cindermere Hollow. I bring salt, iron nails, dried apple, and medicine roots the healers asked for by name. I mean no trespass. Quartermaster grants no writs to outsiders. Then let her tell you that herself. It was at that moment, axe still raised, 4 warriors pressing close enough that Walter could smell the wood smoke on their hides, that the crowd around the trading post's gate split apart like water around a stone, and Gromma Bonecrusher walked through it. She did not hurry. She never hurried. She was tall even among her own kind, her shoulders broad beneath a fitted vest of dark boiled leather laced tight up a torso corded with muscle. The leather cut close at her waist and flaring over strong hips, sleeves rolled to bare forearms marked with old scars, and the fine dust of grain that never quite washed from her hands. Her tusks were small and white, her green-gray skin weathered by years of standing over cookfires and storehouses in every season the valley threw at her, and her black hair was bound back in a single thick braid, threaded with a strip of red cloth that marked her rank. She carried no weapon but the iron ladle hooked at her belt, and somehow that was more frightening than any axe in the yard. "Put it down, Cruv," she said. The warrior with the axe did not put it down immediately, which told Walter everything he needed to know about how much authority she actually held, and how much she was choosing in this moment to spend on a stranger. "He's a spy dressed as a trader," Cruv said. "Skarn does not answer to Bonecrusher quartermasters for who crosses this pass." "No," Gromma agreed, and there was something dangerous under the calm of her voice, something that made even the axe-bearer's shoulders drop half an inch. "But you do answer to the truce, and the truce says I keep this storehouse fed for both clans equal, and I cannot do that without salt and iron and root medicine that neither Bonecrusher nor Skarn has grown in 3 winters. This man brings it. I struck the bargain myself, in the sight of High Matron Nesca, before the melt this spring." She stepped past Cruv as though he were a fence post, close enough to Walter that he had to tip his head back to meet her eyes, dark as riverbed stone. "You are Walter Weston. I am. You are late." The pass was worse than I remembered. Something flickered at the corner of her wide mouth, not quite a smile. "Everything in this valley is worse than you remember, human. That is why I remember, to be exact." She turned back to the warriors, and her voice hardened into something that carried across the whole muddy square of the trading post. "This wagon is under my writ. Any hand laid on it or on him answers to me and to the matron's law, not to clan grievance. Am I understood?" Cruv lowered the axe. It took him a long moment, and his eyes stayed on Walter the whole time, promising this was not finished, only postponed. But he lowered it, and the other 3 followed, and the crowd of onlookers, orc soldiers off duty, a few weathered traders, children too young to have learned to hate anyone yet drifted back to their business as though nothing at all unusual had happened. Walter exhaled slowly. His hands were shaking just slightly, and he was grateful his sleeves were long enough to hide it. "Thank you," he managed. Gromma looked at him for a long moment, assessing, the way a quartermaster might weigh a sack of grain to guess its worth before ever cutting it open. "Do not thank me yet," she said. "You still have to unload that wagon, and I still have to decide if what you brought is worth what I promised you for it." It was, in its own strange way, the beginning of everything. The trading post at Cindermere Hollow sat at the bottom of a valley that never stopped breathing steam. Vents in the black rock hissed pale mist into the cold mountain air at all hours, and hot springs pooled in terraced basins of pale mineral stone down the length of the valley floor, some steaming enough to boil an egg, others cooled to a bath a man could soak in without scalding the skin off his legs. The orcs had built their garrison around the springs, the way a human town might build around a river, because the springs healed wounds faster than any poultice warmed hide tents through brutal mountain winters, and because both the Bonecrusher clan and the Scarn clan, whatever else they hated about each other, agreed that the valley was too valuable to burn to the ground fighting over it. That agreement had a name: the Truce. 10 years old, signed in blood and mineral water after a war that had cost both clans more warriors than either liked to count, and it was kept alive by exactly one arrangement neither side loved but both grudgingly respected. A single joint garrison, soldiers from both clans quartered together, and one quartermaster, chosen by the matron's council, whose only task was to make certain that not one soldier of either clan went hungry while another ate fat. Fairness was not a virtue in Cindermere Hollow. It was the entire structure holding back a second war. Gromma Bonecrusher had held that post for 4 years, and she was, by every soldier's grudging admission, ruthlessly, mathematically fair. She weighed grain to the ounce. She counted strips of dried meat like a miser counted coin. A Scarn soldier and a Bonecrusher soldier standing in her ration line received precisely the same portion, measured by the same scoop, and any soldier of either clan who tried to argue otherwise found himself on the losing end of an argument with a woman who could break a man's forearm with one hand while ladling stew with the other. Which was exactly why what she did for Walter Weston, starting that very first evening, made no sense to anyone who watched it happen. He had unloaded the wagon by lantern light, sweat soaking through his shirt despite the cold, while she inspected every crate with the flat, unhurried attention of a woman who had been cheated by traders before and did not intend to be cheated again. She counted the iron nails. She tasted the dried apple. She unstoppered the jars of root medicine and held them to her nose, and when she was satisfied, she nodded once, the way a general might approve a battle plan, and told him the goods he'd receive in exchange were stacked and waiting by the north storehouse. Then she looked at him gaunt from the road, hands blistered from the wagon reins, shivering though he tried to hide it, and something in her face had shifted, small and private, and gone almost before he saw it. "You will eat before you sleep," she said. It was not a question. "I've got provisions in the wagon." "You will eat," she repeated, in the same tone she used to tell soldiers when their watch began, and led him to the long, open-sided shelter where the garrison took its evening meal. The line moved the way it always moved, orderly, silent, each soldier holding out a wooden bowl, while Gromma stood behind the great iron cauldron with her ladle and her scale, and doled out stew, bread, and a strip of salted meat in portions so precisely equal that a Bonecrusher soldier and a Scarn soldier standing shoulder to shoulder received bowls that could have been poured from the same breath. Walter took his place at the end of the line, feeling every eye in the shelter on him, the only human among 40 armed orcs who had spent most of their lives being taught that his kind were liars and thieves and worse. When his turn came, Gromma filled his bowl. Then she filled it again. A second ladle of stew went in on top of the first, and a second strip of meat beside the first, and a heel of bread thick enough to be 2 men's ration laid across the top of it all. And she did this without a flicker of expression, without pause, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, while 40 soldiers who had just watched their own bowls measured to the exact half-scoop went very, very quiet. "Quartermaster," Walter started, low, aware of the silence spreading behind him like a held breath. "Eat it before it cools," she said, and turned to the next soldier in line as though nothing at all had happened, ladling out his precise, unremarkable portion with the same steady hand. Walter carried his bowl to the end of a bench, sat alone because no one moved to make room, and ate every bite because he was too hungry and too proud to waste it. And all the while he felt the weight of 40 pairs of eyes, and one pair in particular that never quite looked at him again that night, though he was certain, absolutely certain, that she knew he was there. He did not understand it. Not that night, and not for a long while after. He told himself it was pity, or politics, some scrap of the truce he didn't understand, some obligation tied to the trade writ. He told himself a great many things, lying awake in the trader's tent they'd given him at the edge of camp, listening to the springs hiss in the dark, and none of them explained why his chest had gone tight and strange when she'd set that second ladle of stew into his bowl without so much as a word. He came back 6 weeks later, as the bargain required, wagon loaded again more salt, a crate of proper steel needles the healers had begged for, bolts of woven wool the mountain winters demanded. The valley had gone from raw spring mud to a hard green summer, wildflowers pushing up between the black volcanic stone, and the hot spring steamed just as constantly as before, as though the whole valley breathed on its own private rhythm regardless of what the seasons above it did. Cruv did not draw his axe this time. He glared, which Walter decided was progress. Gromma inspected the wagon with the same unhurried thoroughness as before, running her broad hands over the wool, holding the steel needles to the light, and when she was done she looked at him with something that might almost have been approval. "You did not cheat me," she said. "I told you I wouldn't." Traders say a great many things they do not mean. I'm not most traders. No, she agreed, and this time the almost smile at the corner of her mouth stayed a moment longer before she turned away. You are not. That evening in the ration line she did it again, 2 ladles instead of 1, an extra strip of meat, a heel of bread thick enough for 2. And this time when the soldier behind him in line, a broad-shouldered bonecrusher man named Drego, opened his mouth to object, Gromma fixed him with a stare that could have curdled milk and said, without raising her voice at all, "Your bowl was full, soldier, was it not?" "It was, Quartermaster." "Then eat your meal and keep your eyes on your own bowl." Drega ate his meal. But the whispers had already started, the way whispers always start in places too small and too watched for anything to stay quiet, soldiers murmuring over cookfires, over sharpening stones, over the steaming pools where men and women of both clans soaked their aching joints after long watches. The quartermaster favors the human. The quartermaster who measures grain to the ounce, who once broke a scarred captain's finger for skimming from the children's ration, gives the outsider double portions and thinks no one notices. Walter noticed. He noticed every time, 6 weeks apart, all through that long summer, the extra ladle, the thick heel of bread, the strip of meat laid just so on top like it was nothing at all. He noticed the way she never explained it, never apologized for it, never once looked at him while she did it, and yet somehow made him feel entirely seen in the moment the food landed in his bowl. He started trying to give some of it back. Not obviously. He wasn't fool enough to embarrass her in front of her own soldiers, but quietly, passing a strip of meat to a scarred boy too young to be a real soldier, yet who ran errands around the storehouse, sharing bread with an old bonecrusher healer whose hands shook too badly to grind her own medicine roots anymore. He fixed a cracked wagon axle for a family of camp followers without being asked. He mended a scarred soldier's boot with an awl and thread from his own kit after the man's foot had gone raw and bleeding on patrol, and said nothing about it to anyone, and thought no one had seen. Gromma had seen. Gromma, it turned out, saw everything that happened within the boundaries of her storehouse and her ration lines, because fairness required watching, and watching had become, somewhere along the way, something closer to devotion. "You gave away half of what I gave you," she said to him one evening in late summer, catching him alone by the north storehouse as he checked the wagon wheels before the long ride home. Walter straightened, startled to find her there, arms crossed, the last orange light of evening catching the scars on her forearms. Some of the boys need it more than I do. That was not the arrangement. There wasn't an arrangement about what I do with food once it's in my own bowl. She studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression hard to name, harder still to trust softened at the edges. No, she said finally, I suppose there was not. She didn't stop giving him more after that. If anything, she started giving him more of everything. An extra blanket when the autumn nights turned sharp, a jar of the good salve for his blistered palms, a warning once murmured low as he loaded his wagon, that a Scarn patrol had found Bandit's sign on the low pass, and he'd do well to take the long road home instead. He took the long road home. It cost him 2 extra days, and a wagon wheel he had to repair himself in the rain. But 3 weeks later he heard, second-hand, that the low pass had seen a wagon burned, and its driver killed by raiders that same week. And he understood, with a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air, that Gromma Bonecrusher had likely saved his life with nothing more than 11 quiet words. It was around then, sometime in that long golden autumn with the wildflowers gone to seed, and the first frost silvering the black rock at dawn, that Walter Weston admitted to himself, alone in his tent with the springs hissing outside and his heart doing something foolish and unguarded in his chest, that he had fallen in love with an orc quartermaster who filled his bowl twice and would not tell him why. He did not say it to her. He was not fool enough for that, not yet. Not when saying it might cost her everything she'd built. Not when he was a human traitor with no clan, no standing, nothing to offer a woman who commanded the loyalty and grudging respect of 40 armed soldiers from 2 clans that had spent a generation trying to kill each other. So he said nothing, and came back every 6 weeks with his wagon full, and let himself be fed twice as much as any soldier in the yard, and told himself that was enough, that it would have to be enough, and did not entirely believe it. The hot springs at the far southern edge of the valley, past the last of the storehouses, past even the outer picket line, were smaller than the great communal bathing pools near the garrison, shallow terraced basins tucked behind a fold of black rock, warm enough to soak in comfortably, private enough that soldiers rarely bothered walking that far when the closer pools served just as well. Walter had found them by accident one evening in his second summer of trading at Cindermere Hollow, aching from 3 days on the wagon seat, and had taken to slipping down there after his business was concluded before the long ride home, to soak the road out of his bones. He did not expect Gromma to be there. She was sitting on the flat black stone at the edge of the highest pool, boots off, trouser legs rolled to the knee, feet in the steaming water, her braid loosened for once and hanging heavy and dark over one shoulder. In the low firelight from a small lantern she'd set beside her, she looked less like the quartermaster who terrified soldiers into silence and more like simply a woman, tired, alone, watching steam curl up into a darkening sky. I did not know anyone else came this far, Walter said, already half turning to go. Sit, she said without looking at him, or do not. But do not hover at the edge of my quiet like a man deciding whether a thing is safe to touch. He sat, not close a respectful distance, the sort of man kept from a woman who could snap his spine if she chose, but close enough that the lantern light caught them both. You come here often, he said, because the silence demanded something and he had never learned to be comfortable inside it. When the ledgers make my head ache, when the men's grumbling gets too loud in my ears. When I need to remember why I keep this post at all, she flexed her toes in the water. When my back forgets it isn't 20 anymore. When I want to remember what warm feels like before 3 days of frost on the road home. That drew something from her, not quite a laugh but close, a low rumble of amusement that he felt more than heard. You are not so old, Walter Weston. Old enough to know better than to be sitting here. Better than what? He hesitated. The steam curled between them, softening the hard planes of her face, and he thought, not for the first time, that she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in his life, and that thought terrified him more than Kruv's axe ever had. Better than wanting things I've got no right wanting, he said finally, quiet. Honest in the particular way, a man is honest only when he's fairly sure the truth will cost him nothing because it will never be spoken of again. Gromma turned her head and looked at him then, fully, the firelight catching the dark of her eyes, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. "You give away half your ration to boys too young to hold a spear," she said eventually. "You take the long road when I tell you to, without asking why, though it costs you days and blisters. You mended a scarred soldier's boot and never once said a word about it, though I know you did it because I know everything that happens inside my own storehouse yard." She looked back at the water. "I do not give extra rations to soldiers I do not trust, Walter Weston. I have given you extra since the first night you sat in my mess line, and I have never once explained why, and you have never once asked. I didn't want to ruin it by asking." "That," she said, "was wise of you." She was quiet a moment, and when she spoke again her voice had dropped, rougher, more careful. "There have been soldiers in this camp for 4 years who would give a great deal to know why I favor a human traitor over men of my own blood. Some of them think it treason. Some of them think it madness. I have wondered some nights if they are right. And other nights, she said, I think I have simply never met a man, orc or human, who was kind for no reason except that kindness cost him nothing to give, and he could not imagine being any other way. That is a rarer thing than you know, in a valley that has spent a generation teaching itself to hate." Walter's throat had gone tight. He wanted badly to reach across the small space between them and take her hand, and he did not, because a season of denial had taught him the particular ache of wanting a thing so much that touching it felt like it might shatter whatever careful, fragile trust had grown between them. "I'm not going anywhere," he said instead. "Every 6 weeks, same wagon, same road. You'll have plenty of time to decide if I'm worth the extra bread." Something in her face went soft, and for just a moment, just one unguarded moment before she pulled her feet from the water and reached for her boots, before the quartermaster's mask settled back over her features like a door, closing, he thought he saw exactly how much that promise had meant to her. The trouble began, as trouble in Cindermere Hollow always seemed to, with a wagon on the low pass. It was late autumn by then, the frost thick every morning, the spring steaming harder than ever against the cold, and a joint supply caravan, 6 wagons of grain and salted fish bound for a scarn outpost further up the ridge, escorted by soldiers of both clans, as the truce required was ambushed 2 days out from Cindermere Hollow. Raiders, masked and unmarked, struck at dusk, killed 4 soldiers, 3 Bonecrusher and 1 scarn, and made off with 2 of the 6 wagons before the survivors could rally. The garrison that received the news 3 days later did not receive it quietly. Grief in an orc camp was loud, immediate, and it did not stay grief for long before it curdled into something that needed somewhere to point. Captain Ruzka Scarn found somewhere to point it. Walter had met Ruzka only twice before, both times at a distance, a broad-shouldered Scarn officer with a scarred lip and cold, calculating eyes who had never bothered to hide his contempt for the truce, for the joint garrison, and especially for the human traitor who was permitted, inexplicably, to walk freely through a camp that should never have let him pass the gate at all. Ruzka had lost a cousin in the raid. Grief made men reckless, and reckless men, Walter would learn, made very dangerous accusations. "The raiders knew our route," Ruzka announced, 3 days after the news arrived, standing on an overturned crate in the middle of the garrison yard where every soldier of both clans could hear him. "They knew the day we left, the road we took, the number of our escort. That is not luck, that is betrayal." He let the word hang, then turned, deliberately, and pointed one thick finger toward the storehouse where Gromma stood in the doorway, watching him with an expression carved from stone. "And who among us has spent 2 years feeding secrets to an outsider who comes and goes through our gates whenever the quartermaster decides to open them for him?" The yard went utterly silent. "You accuse me of treason," Gromma said, and her voice did not shake at all, though Walter, standing near his wagon at the edge of the yard, feeling his stomach drop through the frozen ground, could see the tension in the set of her shoulders. "I accuse you of feeding a human traitor double rations for 2 years, while men who bleed for this clan eat their measured share and say nothing," Ruzka said. "I accuse you of letting him walk our storehouses, our supply routes, our patrol schedules unwatched, because you have let your judgment be softened by a man who is not kin, not clan, not even our kind. And I say that a woman who breaks fairness for a stranger's sake is a woman who has already broken faith with her own people, and it is no great leap from there to selling our roots to raiders for whatever coin or comfort that human offers her in return." "That's a lie," Walter said, and his voice cracked across the yard before he'd fully decided to speak at all. Every eye turned to him. "I've never breathed a word of this camp's business to anyone outside it. I don't even know your patrol schedules." "The human speaks," Ruzka said with a slow, contemptuous smile. "How convenient that he speaks now to defend the woman who's been warming his belly with stolen rations for 2 years. "They weren't stolen," Gromma said, sharp as a blade. "I fed him from my own portion, Ruzka. I have gone without to give him more, and that is my right as quartermaster to decide, and no crime against this clan or any other." "Prove it," Ruzka said, and something in his voice had gone very cold, very final. "Prove it before the High Matron, Quartermaster, or I will bring this before the council as treason, and you know as well as I do what the council does with traitors in a season already bloodied by raiders." His eyes cut to Walter and lingered there with an ugly satisfaction. "Both of you." The days that followed were the longest of Walter's life. He was not permitted to leave the valley. Ruzka saw to that, posting Skarn guards at the trading post gate under the thin pretext of protecting the investigation. And so he stayed, sleeping little, watching Gromma grow more distant and more exhausted by the hour as she was summoned again and again before hastily convened councils of Bonecrusher and Skarn elders, questioned about ledgers, about rations, about every extra scoop of stew she had ever given him. She never once in all those questionings denied that she had favored him. "I told them the truth," she said to him on the 3rd night, in the trader's tent at the edge of camp, her voice hollow with exhaustion. "I told them I gave you more because I chose to, because you never once asked for it and never once abused it, because in 2 years you have never given me a single reason to regret it. I told them it was not treason to feed a good man well. I do not know if they believed me." "This is my fault," Walter said. "If I'd never come through that pass." "Do not," Gromma said, sharp enough to cut him off entirely. "Finish that sentence. I chose to feed you. I chose to trust you. I have made harder choices than that in worse seasons and never once flinched from them. And I will not start flinching now, because a grieving man needs somewhere to point his anger." But her hands, when she reached for the edge of the tent flap, were not quite steady, and Walter understood, with a cold certainty that settled in his gut like river ice, that she was more frightened than she would ever say aloud. He found the medallion 2 days later, and it changed everything. He had ridden, against every instinct for self-preservation he possessed, past the Skarn guards at the gate. Cruv, of all people, let him through without a word, and Walter would wonder for the rest of his life whether that had been an accident or a mercy out along the low pass to the site of the ambushed caravan, where the burned wagon still sat black and skeletal against the frost-white ground. He searched the wreckage for hours, cold to the bone, certain he was hunting for something he wouldn't recognize even if he found it. He found it half buried in ash beneath the second wagon's ruined axle, a small bronze medallion, warped by fire but not destroyed, stamped with a sigil he'd seen only once before, on the collar of a Skarn courier who'd ridden into camp 3 weeks prior, delivered a message directly to Ruzka's tent, and ridden out again before nightfall. The medallion was a raider's token, the kind border bandits used to mark which caravans were safe to let pass and which were fair game, and it bore, unmistakably, stamped into the reverse side, the private mark of Ruzka Skarn's own household. Walter rode back to Cindermere Hollow through the night, the medallion burning cold in his fist, and reached the garrison just as dawn broke gray and bitter over the steaming valley. Just in time, he would later realize, to save Gromma Bonecrusher's life by a matter of seconds. The council had convened at first light in the sunken stone circle beside the largest of the hot springs, where the valley's justice had always been dispensed, steam rising in thick white sheets around a crowd of nearly the whole garrison, Bonecrusher and Scarn alike, gathered in a ring around the ancient basin. High Matron Nesca, small and stooped and ancient beyond reckoning, sat on a flat stone throne at the circle's head, and before her, on her knees in the frost with her wrists bound in iron chain, was Gromma Bonecrusher. Ruzka Scarn stood over her with a ceremonial blade raised in both hands, and the words he spoke carried clear across the whole silent crowd. "Treason against the truce is death," he said. "The council has heard the evidence. The quartermaster favored an outsider above her own soldiers, gave him freedom of the storehouses and the supply schedules, and within that same season, raiders struck a caravan they had no way to predict unless someone inside these walls fed them the route. I ask the matron for judgment." "The evidence is circumstantial," High Matron Nesca said, though her ancient voice carried a weight that silenced even Ruzka's confidence for a moment. "Favor is not proof of treason." "Then let the blade decide," Ruzka said, and raised it higher, and Walter, still half a mile off, his horse foundering through drifted snow on the last stretch of the low road, heard the crowd's collective breath catch even from that distance, carried strange and sharp on the cold mountain air. He rode the horse harder than he had ever ridden anything in his life. He came over the last ridge above the garrison just as the blade began its downward arc toward Gromma Bonecrusher's bared neck, the whole valley below him a tableau frozen in steam and firelight and horror, and he did not think, did not weigh the cost, did not do anything at all except throw himself from the still-moving horse and run. "Stop!" His voice tore across the valley loud enough to make Ruzka's blade falter mid-swing, loud enough that every head in that vast silent crowd turned as one, and Walter Weston, half frozen, chest heaving, medallion clutched in one bloodless fist, threw himself down the last slope and into the stone circle, and put his own body between Gromma Bonecrusher and the blade with less than a heartbeat to spare. The edge of it kissed his shoulder before Ruzka managed to wrench it fully back, a shallow cut that soaked through his coat almost instantly, red against the white frost, and the crowd's gasp at that was audible even over the hiss of the springs. "Move, human," Ruzka snarled, blade still raised, "or die with her." "Then I'll die," Walter said, and he did not move, though his legs were shaking so badly he could barely stand, though every soldier in that circle could surely see how frightened he was. "But you'll have to explain to the whole valley why you killed an unarmed traitor to keep him from showing you this." He held up the medallion, turned it so the firelight caught the warped bronze, so the sigil stamped into its reverse face was visible to the entire ring of watching soldiers. "This was found at the burned caravan. It's a raider's marker, and it bears your household's private mark, Captain Ruzka Scarn, not hers." The silence that followed was absolute. "That proves nothing," Ruzka said, but his voice had changed, gone tight and thin, and Walter saw it, saw the exact moment the crowd's attention shifted, saw High Matron Nesca rise slowly from her stone throne with an expression that had gone from weary tolerance to something far colder. "Bring it here," she said. Walter crossed the circle on legs that barely held him and placed the medallion in the ancient orc woman's withered hand. She turned it over twice, studied the mark with eyes that had clearly seen every household sigil in 2 clans across a very long lifetime, and looked up at Ruzka Scarn with a stillness that was somehow more terrifying than any shout could have been. "This is your mark, Captain. It was stolen, planted. This human would say anything to save his. A courier rode into this camp 3 weeks past," Walter said, his voice steadier now, anger burning through the fear, and went straight to your tent before he ever reported to the garrison commander. I saw it. Half this yard saw it, if anyone cares to ask. I rode 2 days to that burned caravan and found this beneath the ash. And I would stake my life on the fact that raiders who knew our route so precisely were told it by someone who had every reason to see the truce broken, and every reason to see a Bonecrusher quartermaster blamed for it instead of himself. He staked his life on exactly that, Gromma said, her voice raw from the cold and the chains but steady now, steadier than Walter's own. The moment he put his body in front of your blade, Ruzka. Ask yourself how many innocent men do that for a lie. The crowd had begun to murmur, a low, dangerous sound rolling through the assembled soldiers of both clans, and Walter watched Ruzka Skarn's face cycle through fury and calculation. And finally, the particular desperate stillness of a man who understood the ground beneath him had just given way entirely. "Captain Ruzka Skarn," High Matron Neska said, and her voice, though frail, carried to every corner of that steaming stone circle. "You will answer for this before the full council, and if the mark on this medallion proves what it appears to prove, you will answer for the deaths of 4 soldiers with your own blood, by the old law, and no truce or clan pride will shield you from it." She turned to 2 Bonecrusher guards standing near the circle's edge. "Take him. Chain him as she was chained until the council can weigh the truth of this properly." It happened fast after that. Ruzka's blade wrestled from his hands, his own wrists bound in the same iron that had held Gromma moments before, his protests swallowed by a crowd that had gone, in the space of a few frantic minutes, from bloodthirsty certainty to something closer to shame. Walter barely registered any of it. He was on his knees in the frost beside Gromma, his numb fingers fumbling uselessly at the iron chain around her wrists, until a Bonecrusher soldier Drega, the very man who'd once complained about his double ration, knelt to help him work the lock free without a word. The moment her hands came loose, Gromma reached for him. She caught his face in both palms, careless of the blood soaking through his coat, and stared at him with an expression Walter had never once seen on her in 2 years of quiet glances, an unexplained kindness, as something raw and unguarded, and utterly without armor. Fear and fury and relief all tangled together and spilling out of her at once. "You fool," she said, her voice breaking on the word. "You absolute reckless fool, you put your body under his blade. I wasn't going to let you die for something you didn't do. You could have died. I didn't. You could have." She stopped, because her voice had given out entirely, and instead of finishing the sentence she pulled him against her, careless of the crowd still watching, careless of the blood, careless of 2 years of careful distance kept between them like a wall neither had dared to breach, and held him there in the steam and the frost while the whole garrison looked on. It was not, Walter would think later, a graceful moment. He was bleeding and shaking and half frozen, and she was chafed raw at both wrists and trembling with an adrenaline that had nowhere left to go. And neither of them said anything else at all for a long, long moment, simply held on, breathing hard against the cold, while High Matron Neska watched them both with an expression that might, on a kinder face, have been called a smile. They tended his wound in the healer's tent that evening shallow. The healer assured them both firmly, a clean line across the shoulder that would scar but heal true. And it was there, hours later, with the tent quiet and the lanterns burned low, and the last of the day's chaos finally settling into something like calm, that Gromma sat beside his cot, and for the first time in 2 years, reached out and simply took his hand. Her fingers were rough, calloused from years of ladles and grain sacks and cookfire iron, and Walter's breath caught at the touch of them anyway, at the plain, unhurried fact of her hand wrapped around his, thumb tracing slow, absent circles over his knuckles, as though she could not quite stop herself now that she had finally allowed herself to start. "I have wanted to do this," she said quietly, not looking at him, watching their joined hands instead, Since the first night you sat alone in my mess line and ate every bite of a bowl I had no right to fill twice and never once asked me why. You could have just told me. And say what? That the quartermaster, who breaks no rule for any soldier in this camp, had broken the only rule that mattered for a human traitor she barely knew, because something about the way you looked at everyone in this valley, orc, human, child, soldier, as though they all deserved kindness whether they'd earned it or not, made her feel something she had spent 30 years teaching herself not to feel at all. She finally looked up, and her dark eyes were bright, unguarded, terrifyingly honest. I did not have the words for it, Walter Weston. I still am not certain I have them now. I only knew that every 6 weeks, when your wagon came over that ridge, something in my chest that had gone quiet a long time ago woke up again, and I did not know how to stop it, and eventually I did not want to. Walter turned his hand beneath hers, slow, careful, and laced their fingers together properly, the way he had wanted to do 100 times across 2 years of steaming pools and mess lines and stolen glances across a crowded storehouse yard. I love you, he said simply, because he had carried the words so long they came easy now that the danger had passed, easy as breathing. I think I've loved you since that first bowl of stew, if I'm honest, though it took me a lot longer than it should have to admit it to myself. I know, Gromma said, and this time she did smile, small and real and utterly unguarded. I am the quartermaster. I notice everything that happens in my own storehouse. She lifted his hand, pressed her lips to his knuckles, slow and deliberate, a gesture so tender after 2 years of careful distance that Walter felt it land somewhere deep in his chest like a struck bell. But I wanted to hear you say it before I said what I am about to say. Say it then. She reached into the pouch at her belt, the same worn leather pouch she carried her ration ledgers in, and drew out a small carved token of pale bone, no bigger than a thumbnail, etched with a spiral mark Walter had seen tattooed on the wrists of a few older Bonecrusher warriors and never fully understood. This is a claiming mark, she said. Among my clan, when a warrior chooses a mate for life, she carves this from bone taken from her own kill and gives it to the one she has chosen, and if he takes it, he is hers before every clan and every god that watches this valley, and there is no unmaking it short of death. Her hand, holding the token out toward him, was not quite steady. I have never carved one before. I did not think I would ever want to. I carved this 3 nights ago, before the trial, before I knew if either of us would live to see this evening, because I could not bear the thought of dying without you knowing what you were to me. Walter's throat had closed entirely. He looked at the small pale token in her palm, at the woman holding it out to him with her heart laid as bare as he had ever seen it, and he thought of 2 years of wagons and cold roads and lonely nights in a trader's tent, of a life spent drifting from post to post with no place that had ever felt like home. And he understood, with a certainty that settled through him like warmth returning to frozen limbs, that he was looking at the end of every kind of loneliness he had ever known. I take it, he said, voice rough. Gromma, I take it and I take you, and I'm not going anywhere, not back over that pass, not anywhere, unless you're standing right beside me. She closed his fingers around the bone token with both her hands, and then, slow, deliberate, giving him every chance in the world to pull away though he never once wanted to, she leaned down and kissed him. The first kiss, after a season and more of denial, of careful distance, of 2 ladles of stew that had said everything neither of them had dared say aloud. And it was not a gentle thing, not entirely, but it was honest. Hungry in the way of 2 people who had waited far longer than either of them had wanted to. And Walter Weston, wounded and exhausted and happier than he had been in more years than he cared to count, kissed her back with everything he had. Ruzka Skarn's guilt was confirmed within the week of full accounting of the courier's movements. A search of his private stores that turned up raider goods traded quietly for coin and grievance, and a Skarn soldier's whispered confession that the captain had spent a year nursing a hatred of the truce that finally curdled into treason of his own. He was stripped of rank by the Joint Council, exiled from both clan territories under the old law, sent out through Ashfall Pass with nothing but the clothes on his back, and a warning that he would be killed on sight if he ever returned. Gromma was restored to her post with an honor she had never held before, not merely tolerated fairness now, but trusted, celebrated. The quartermaster who had been falsely accused and had never once, even facing the blade, betrayed the truth of who she was. Walter's wound healed clean, as the healer had promised, leaving a thin, pale scar across his shoulder that Gromma traced with her fingers sometimes in quiet moments, as though she still needed to remind herself he had survived it. He did not return to the human border towns that winter, nor the winter after. He built, with Drega's help and a great deal of Bonecrusher patience for a human's clumsy carpentry, a proper cabin at the edge of the trading post, close enough to the storehouse that he could hear the ration bell each morning, close enough to the small southern hot springs that he and Gromma could walk down together most evenings when her ledgers were finally closed for the day. He kept trading when the passes allowed it, but the long solitary hauls of furs across empty wilderness gave way to shorter runs with company beside him on the wagon seat, and the loneliness that had followed him down every mountain road for most of his adult life simply stopped, the way a long ache stops when the bone finally sets true. The following spring, on an evening when the wildflowers had pushed up again through the black volcanic stone, and the whole valley steamed pale gold in the last of the sun, Walter stood in the mess line at Cindermere Hollow the way he had 100 times before, holding out his bowl toward the great iron cauldron. Gromma filled it once. Then, in full view of every soldier in that line, Bonecrusher and Scarn both, none of them so much as blinking now, because this had long since stopped being scandal and become simply the truth of things. She filled it a second time, laid an extra strip of meat across the top, and met his eyes with a small, open, entirely unguarded smile. "Eat it before it cools," she said, the same words she had said to him on that very first night 2 years past, except now there was no secrecy in them at all, no lowered voice, no careful distance, only a woman who had chosen him in front of her whole clan and would go on choosing him, openly, fairly, fiercely, for as many seasons as the mountain gave them. Walter took his bowl and did not sit alone at the end of a bench this time, but beside her, as he always did now, as he intended to for the rest of his life, and understood with a warmth that had nothing at all to do with the steam rising off the hot springs around them, that he had finally, after a long season of wandering, come home.